Greetings, EPQers, and welcome to one of the final lessons on EPQ. So there'll be one, possibly two more, just rounding up a few things, a bit of a checklist as to what you need to do when you hand in, and a few other bits and bobs. But I think this is the last big, significant chunk of work that need to be done. So let's get stuck straight into it. So what you need to do after your presentation, although you can start doing this before, there is a little bit on the presentation that needs to be included. So I would wait till after the presentation, but there's no reason why, as I say, you can't do it before. So this is part of the mark scheme AO4, and this is evaluation. So your ability to evaluate the project, and this is worth 9 marks. So out of 54, again, that's substantial. It's nothing in comparison to the discussion, but there's a good few grade boundaries in there if you don't bother with the evaluation or the presentation. So it's important to do and do well. In terms of word counts, this should be about 750 words, and again, it's the sort of usual rule of EPQ. If you do 850 words of pure gold, you're absolutely fine. If you do 600 words of nonsense, you're not going to score any marks. Just remember, with word limits, if you're going above it, make double sure that it's relevant and good quality stuff, and you won't lose any any marks at all, and you will gain marks. So what does the mark scheme actually say? Well, it says you need to demonstrate a high level of insight and self-awareness, and that's with regard to your aims. So were the aims sensible aims? Did you meet the aims? What could you do? What could you have done better to meet the aims? How will meeting the aims guide you in future projects? All those sorts of things. You also need to identify and analyze limitations. So did you achieve everything? What stopped you achieving it? And again, reflection, how could you prevent that happening in the future? And you've also got to explain and justify ideas for further works. So, what would you do better next time? So this is a little different to the conclusions. The conclusions to further works are kind of conceptual, if you like. So I've done a project on legalizing cannabis. So in the future, I'll do a project on maybe legalizing hard drugs, or something along those lines. Could we go to Mars? Should we go to Mars? Yes, and in the future we should go to Jupiter as well. Whereas this, ideas and future works is more about techniques. So in the future, I will use project management software at the very beginning. I will do 7 Gantt charts rather than 4 to keep a closer track. So this is more about the kind of evaluation of project skills for the future rather than concepts which you dealt with in your conclusion. So hopefully that makes some sense. Right. So again, some of these things can be blurred together, and I'm not saying that you should necessarily have 6 separate paragraphs or sections. But I think this is probably how I would structure it. So you start off with the objectives and to what extent they were met. Then look at the limitation in sources. So that could be the way you research them, the way you analyze them, the reliability of them, anything to do with sources. Next section would be the limitations in the discussion, be that time, be that knowledge, be that technique, be that linguistic. Were you doing an EPQ on Germany and didn't speak German? There'd be a huge range of sources that you couldn't then access. Were you doing a science EPQ but didn't have statistical knowledge to really explore some of the more complex arguments? The next thing you need to do is the presentation. So a reflection on the presentation. This is why you should probably do this evaluation after your presentation. But like I say, it's not compulsory. You can easily edit in a presentation section. The next thing is hindsight. So what would you have done differently in a sort of quite large sort of project management sense? It could be all sorts of things. How would you tweak the question? How would you have planned your time? There's a whole range of things you can look at. And then finally, and again, really not a very long section, but how would you apply all of these things to the future, to your career, to life? So a bit waffly, but it's there. It's part of the mark scheme. nonetheless. Right, so let's have a look at some of these things in a little bit more detail. So let's start off. I think you need to start your evaluation with an evaluation of the degree to which you met your objectives. And what you need to do, and remember we need to make sure our EPQ links together, is compare the, or make this judgment rather, with explicit reference to the project proposal and objectives that you've laid out in other areas, so your timelines and your Gantt charts and things like that. So to what extent did you meet those project objectives? Was it to a degree? Was it mostly? And again, remember there's no harm in admitting, in identifying and admitting limitations. In fact, it's part of the mark scheme. So I would think you'd probably be erring on the side of having largely met your objectives, but a part of an objective, or maybe a single objective or something wasn't quite met because it was inappropriate, there wasn't time, you couldn't find the knowledge, you couldn't understand the literature on it. There's 1,001 things, 1,001 reasons why you may not have met all of your objectives perfectly, and just think of sensible, valid reasons and express them clearly. Other things to think about in objectives is how effectively did you answer the question overall, and again something to think about. If you were doing a very mathematical or very sciencey EPQ, did you have the numerical ability to understand the higher statistical arguments? Have you only been able to access a medical EPQ on abortion or something like that? Have you got the sense that actually there's a whole layer of sort of intellectual literature that you couldn't quite access? I wouldn't, and again, you've got to be a little bit careful and measured. Don't go down the route of saying, well, I don't have the knowledge, so basically didn't understand any of it. It's not. I wouldn't acknowledge that as a limitation. It's just maybe this one or two objectives, or this element of my objective, I couldn't quite access the, or I didn't have the sort of intellectual specialism required in order to answer this part of the question. Something along those lines. So, very good. How did you, to what extent did you meet your objectives, referring back to the project proposal? Well done. Right, the next thing that you need to look at is your limitation in sources and research. So, really this is focusing around, search methodology. So, how effective was your searching technique? Did you understand how to go to a library and do effective research? How good was your Googling? Did you look at appropriate websites? Did you look at them enough? All those kind of relatively simple things. Did you ever speak to a librarian in person? If you did that revolutionize how you found things? And again, this covers a whole range of techniques. So the next thing, were you able to assess reliability of all sources effectively? And again, you're unlikely to have done this perfectly, and in a sense you almost need to have not done it perfectly, so you've then got something to talk about. So you need to think about what you could do better in future to assess the reliability of sources. So could you do more cross-referencing? Could you examine someone's bibliography and compare it to other bibliographies? Did you really have the time to go in depth into the academic reliability of a publishing house or a university college, or something along those lines? So there's always what you've done, I'm sure, is good, but there's always just an extra level of detail or focus that you could have done, and this is the place to acknowledge it. And again, what we're generally trying to do with this evaluation is say, I was about 80% there, but the final 20%, this is what I could have done to get there in almost any of these sections, really. The next thing that you could think about, again, is technical comprehension. We've talked about it before, but did you have the technical knowledge to understand a lot of the sources, be that mathematical, medical, all of those sorts of things? Would you have spent more time at the beginning of your EPQ learning key terminology, which would have allowed you to understand some sources? Maybe you would have improved your searching, the sort of search technique area. And again, all of these things, they're so EPQ specific and individual, relevant to you as individuals. So, you know, some EPQs will have a real kind of maybe mathematical direction, others a real sort of terminology direction, and others that might not be relevant. So you've got to obviously make your own judgment. Next, your limitations in discussion. So hopefully, you know, as you've seen, there's an element of weaving them all together, but, you know, think about things like this. So, you know, what were the limitations of your arguments? So, you know, you could only really do 4 or 5 sections. Was choosing those 4 or 5 sections really hard? Did you choose the right 4 or 5 sections? You know, on reflection, should maybe section 4 have been finance rather than environment? Or, you know, should that have been, you know, a focus on cannabis rather than a focus on heroin? Or, you know, again, very much depending on the EPQ. So, you know, were the sections that you chose actually the best 4 or 5 sections? You know, did the structure allow you to have the argument that you particularly wanted? You know, did you divide it up into, you know, France, Germany, Spain, and UK, and then within that discuss environment, economics, and education? And having done the EPQ, you're now thinking, actually, I should have split it up into different concepts. You know, I should have done education, environment, and what should I say? Education, and then use the different countries within those sections, which would have made it easier to compare countries. You know, was there something about the structure that you could tweak, alter, or change, and improve things? Limitations of the argument. You know, again, you had to choose 4 or 5. Was there a 6th or 7th that you really wanted to include but didn't have time because of word count, timing, all those kinds of things? You know, was there a technical limitation to your argument? You know, if you're looking at the space race, were there sort of statistics and mechanisms and models and all these sorts of things that couldn't be expressed in an EPQ for whatever reason? And again, be a little bit sane, but yeah. Good. So what were the limitations of the discussion? Now, this is where you need to reflect on the presentation. And I think the presentation, I mean, obviously you could go back to the presentation mark sheet and have a look at that if you particularly wanted to, but I'd probably just break it down into these 3 areas, nice and simple. So how good was your delivery, your physical ability to give a speech? Was it loud enough? Did you make eye contact? You know, what will you do better to improve next time? The next thing to reflect on was the PowerPoint. And again, were there too many slides, too few slides, too much information on the slides, not enough information, some crazy graphics, an irrelevant video? You know, what was it about it that worked, and what was it about it that didn't work? And finally, with the presentation, how effectively did you answer the questions? Were you well prepared? Did you have the ability to think on the spot? If you didn't, what would have given you that ability? And again, we want to go down the route of being, well, it was largely successful. These are the tweaks that I'd make. Sometimes you read evaluations to very good projects where people go, it was a disaster. It was a complete failure on all fronts. And you go, well, no, it wasn't. It's fine. You know, don't panic. Acknowledge limitations, but also acknowledge strengths. So the next little section, or integrated, is a kind of quite big hindsight, not quite section, more paragraph, whatever you want to call it, but what would you have done differently? And again, probably looking at some quite big picture things, but here are 3 great areas to focus on. So the question, was it actually the question itself that could have done with a bit of tweaking? Did you word it in a way that actually, as you got through the EPQ, you realized, well, this is okay, but I should have included something else in the wording or the focus? And again, it's about, there could be some big changes, but there's an element of a, you know, of a slight sort of tweak to it, rather than I did a question on abortion and I hate it, I wish I'd done a question on anime. You know, it's not, I just, you know, just don't go down that road. You know, the anime road as much as anything else. Next thing to consider, so planning. And again, this is a classic, and again, wherever possible, refer back to the project proposal or your Gantt chart, or, you know, the hour by hour thing. So, you know, a classic is, I overestimated how long this would take, and I underestimated how long this would take. I overestimated the my ability to do 6 hours a week. I underestimated the impact of doing history coursework at the same time. And so in future, with a large project, I will blah, 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 blah. Other things to consider are, the execution itself. So how did you stay disciplined, especially during COVID? How did you stay organized? How did you develop? How did you change? All those sorts of things. And again, don't forget what went well. So really, we're probably putting forward this idea of 80% of things going well, but there being a kind of 20% to work on. And in some areas, it'll be a bit different. There may be the odd little area of disaster, but I wouldn't go overboard on the negativity. So the final aspect to it all is the application, and it's a bit, it can be a bit waffly because you're talking about something in the future that you don't necessarily know. I mean, hopefully you've all got sort of university places or somewhere to move on to next, and you know where you're going and what you're doing, and it can be a relatively clear thread, but it's not always the case. But anyway, how are you going to use these skills that you've picked up in the future? Well, think about career, think about education, and think about life in general. So statistical analysis, great for careers, great for further education, time management, planning, even a bit of knowledge. If you're going off to med school and you've done a medically relevant EPQ, that could be very significant. And the next thing to sort of finish off with, and again, these could well be only a few sentences, but has there been a sort of monumental change in knowledge, attitude, or understanding? So almost finish with a kind of final thought, really. Has your studying, the question, should we legalize prostitution or drugs or the political system or any of those kind of things, has that actually really made you think something really quite different? You started off with a suggestion that you should legalize drugs, and now you've gone, actually, no, in retrospect, it's more complicated, it's a bit different, I've changed my mind. Or, and again, relatively broad, but I think that's quite an interesting way to finish, compare your starting view with your new view, and that view could just be more detail, and how that sort of generally informs your attitude and understanding of life and the future. Right, so there's quite a lot of stuff in there. It's quite a bit bitty, and remember, again, it doesn't have to be really cut up into those clean clinical sections. There can be a relative amount of sort of mishmashing together into 3 paragraphs or whatever. So it's kind of up to you. It's a bit up to the way you write, and it's a bit up to the genuine findings of your EPQ. So top tips. First of all, make sure you're linking it to other parts of the EPQ, especially the project proposal, but it could be any part, the discussion, the research review, and be explicit. Quote, like May, say that there is a link. So in my research review, I argued blah blah blah, or I did this, or I did that. My objective in my project proposal was, quotation marks, I failed to meet it because blah blah blah. So again, use this as an opportunity to link your project together and make explicit reference to the goals and aims that you set yourself. Especially things like your your timeline and your Gantt charts and things like that. The second thing to really remember is that this EPQ is a little bit unusual in that you have to admit that you've made some mistakes. So often exams and things are about trying to give the impression that you've made no mistakes whatsoever, but in EPQ you have to show an awareness of limitations, of mistakes, of issues, but importantly say why they're significant or why they're not significant, and how they'll inform your practice for the future. So acknowledge those limitations and express how they could be fixed and how they could be done better in the future. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually how you get the marks. again, just a reminder, that doesn't mean that the evaluation is this whole thing was a disaster from start to finish. This is all the things I did wrong. It was terrible. It's a, think of a kind of 80-20 rule, if you like. 80% it's all good, but there is a 20% which is significant but not catastrophic that I need to adapt, change, or develop. The other thing that's probably not really, well, it's not there, but it is what went well. And again, throughout the evaluation, throughout the project, there will be things that went really, really well, and acknowledge those too and highlight them. And I think with those, a way of reflecting on those is to explain how you'll apply them to other situations in the future. And if you're looking back on your EPQ, how you did something, it went well, and so you applied it to another part of your EPQ, be that research, be that writing, be that whatever. So refer to other parts of your EPQ, acknowledge the limitations, and acknowledge what went well. And then you have done your job and you are within sniffing distance of finishing. So as always, if there are any issues, dramas, questions or queries, then do send me a message over Teams. Otherwise, I will see you for probably one final video next time. Take care, guys.